Good morning and welcome to virtual New Haven. Today we begin the first of two consecutive conferences focusing on business corporations. Both conferences are jointly sponsored by three organizations, by Yale University, by the Global Corporate Governance Colloquium, and by the European Corporate Governance Institute. Now, the latter two of these organizations, ECGI and GCGC as they're known by their members, typically focus on current policy, and their academic interest members are principally economists and legal scholars. Yet it's transparently clear that the forces of history lie heavily on organizational structures of all types, including particularly commercial organizations. Consequently, we can't understand the role and structure of organizations in contemporary society without knowing their history. Indeed, despite the brash and irresponsible talk one sometimes hears about the so-called end of history for corporate law, the evolution of the business corporation is continuing rapidly down paths with origins clearly in the past and particularly in the 19th century. Those historical roots are the subject of today's conference. To explore them, we've turned to scholars who generally identify themselves not as economists or as legal scholars, but as historians. Indeed, one of our most important objectives in organizing this conference is to build better bridges among scholars from different disciplines. Thanks to the wide erudition and dedicated effort of my Yale colleague, Naomi Lamoreaux, all five of today's papers focus on the patterns of corporate ownership that prevailed at the turn of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century, I'm sorry, roughly between 1880 and 1930. But each paper looks at those developments as played out in a different country, very different countries. So we have the luxury of seeing the parallel evolution of the same basic institution in five very different societies. For the conduct of the conference itself, I turn you now over to Naomi Lamoreaux.
Thank you, Henry. It's been a pleasure to work with you on this conference. Welcome, everyone. We have a terrific set of papers to discuss today. And in addition to the paper givers and the formal commentators, we have a group of participants who will help us enrich and sharpen our discussion of the individual papers. I just want to take a few minutes to go over the plan for the day. Our goal is to have as much time for discussion as possible. To this end, the authors are going to take no more than 15 minutes to present the high points of their papers. The rest of the 50 minutes that is allotted to each paper will be for discussion, and questions can be raised by the panelists and by the audience more generally. So I want to tell you a little bit how it's going to go. Well, this morning we're going to discuss the papers by Amanda Gregg, Jihan Archunch, and Madeline Zellen. We're going to take 10-minute breaks in between each paper, and then we'll break for lunch and come back to discuss the papers by Eric Hilt and John Turner. Our final session will be a general discussion that will be kicked off with formal comments by Giuseppe Dari Macciacci and Tim Gannan. And they will each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to the for participants and the audience for further discussion. Members of the audience who wish to ask a question should use the Q&A function and write your question. If possible, the panelists will respond to the questions orally, but if not, they will try to respond to them in writing through the Q&A function itself. And all of our panelists can respond in writing to the questions. And finally, we're going to have a social hour at the end of the conference at 4 o'clock. Elaine McPartland, who has been the indispensable organizer of this conference, will send you instructions about how to ask questions. And also later today, she'll send you a link and tell you how to join the social hour. And she's going to be, she's our fix-it person. If you run into any problems, email her, and she's going to be monitoring our discussion throughout the day to make sure we don't fall into some technical catastrophe. So we have just a big thanks to her and to her staff for all their hard work putting this conference together, and also their hard work today. So without further ado, we might as well just get started. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Amanda Gregg, who is an assistant professor of economics at Middlebury College and a specialist in Russian economic history. And she's going to speak for 15 minutes on her paper, Shareholder Democracy under Autocracy, Voting Rights and Corporate Performance in Imperial Russia. And this paper is co-authored with Stephen Nafziger and Amy Dayton, and I believe Steve is here to help Amanda with the Q&A. So without further ado, Amanda.
So much for that kind introduction, Naomi, and thank you, Naomi, Henry, and all the organizers for putting together this wonderful conference. I've learned, so much from everyone else who is speaking, so it's really an honor to be included. So as Naomi mentioned, this is joint work with Steve Nafziger and Amy Dayton, and Amy Dayton was actually my thesis student at Middlebury College who worked on some of these issues a few years ago. And for this paper, we begin with maybe too large a motivating question, but a big motivating question, which is how do corporations or firms in general in late industrializing contexts attract external finance? And the question of how firms in any context attract this kind of financing has generated a really large literature. And to paint this literature with a broad brush, it has stressed the importance of having a political system that encourages the new entry of firms, and perhaps the influence of legal families as a proxy for specific laws that could be beneficial for attracting finance to corporations. But aside from the laws themselves, there are other ways that corporations themselves can take actions to attract financing. For example, they can write their own rules that provide protection for minority shareholders who might otherwise be afraid that firm insiders or larger shareholders could do whatever they want without their input. And these kinds of principal agent problems may be especially acute in late industrializing or developing contexts with nascent capital markets and other obstacles. However, most of the literature that I've referenced already has focused largely on developed contexts. One important exception, of course, is Shihan Artunç, who'll be presenting right after me. In our paper, we're going to be investigating how corporations in the Russian Empire are perhaps able to write rules to encourage the attraction of external finance. And the Russian Empire is really an endlessly fascinating context for these kinds of questions. They really have three strikes against them. The Russian Empire was a civil law country that had an incredibly sparse commercial code. There were very few rules written formally in law that protected small minority shareholders. They were ruled by an autocratic regime, and also they were poor. Had a very small industrial sector. It was a largely agrarian economy. But the thing is in this very poor context, the economy and the industrial sector in particular was growing rapidly from approximately the 1880s through the turn of the 20th century. And what I have found really interesting about this context is the question of how this happened. Plus, the Russian Empire, a benefit of autocracy is that the Russian Empire generated incredibly detailed, high quality corporation and firm level data, which allows us to investigate perhaps how this happened. In our paper, we're focusing on corporations, so only one type of firm, and they only accounted for a very small percentage of all establishments in the economy. However, these corporations were incredibly economically important. They accounted for as much as 43% of industrial revenue across 3 industrial censuses. So they're economically important. So what we describe characterizes a lot about the industrial economy overall. Furthermore, as I've described to you in a few slides, incorporation in this economy was restricted. But in some of the papers I've written previously, I've argued that those firms that did manage to incorporate in this system not only were large in terms of their economic importance, but also incorporation was critical for their ability to add financing that allowed them to add productivity enhancing modern machinery. So again, it's really kind of a puzzle how they were able to do this. So this paper asks really two central questions. First, we aim to simply describe how these entities in the Russian Empire were governed. So we want to understand how and why governance provisions in Russian corporations varied across entities. And also we want to understand the consequences of the ways that they wrote their governance provisions. So how did the design of these charters relate to their financial strategies and their performance? On this slide, I'm going to rather audaciously explain the key facts you need to understand about this context as quickly as I can. So first, to understand Russia, you need to remember that the Russian Empire by the 1890s was a gigantic, vast territory, about a sixth of the Earth's surface, ruled by an autocratic regime, ruled by Tsarism. And this has led to a highly imperfect regulatory and information environment for firms in general. Also, this country had a concession system of incorporation. Corporations that wanted to be formed had to obtain special permission from the Ministry of Finance and ultimately from the Tsar himself, which was costly and time-consuming for these firms. Finally, let me say a few points about the financial system, which will be important for understanding the implications of what I'm going to show you. So you should think of the financial system in the Russian Empire as being small, but relatively well integrated. So some of the options that firms had for obtaining financing included informal finance, trade credit, or family and friends. There were active but relatively thin securities markets. So for example, there were relatively well-integrated stock markets in Moscow and especially in St. Petersburg. There was a well-integrated but small banking sector that mostly focused on short and medium-term financing, so not long-term financing. The state has an important role in creating particularly important financial institutions and also providing guarantees for some securities, for example, railroads. And also, many of you may know that there was a large importance of foreign financing in the Russian Empire in this period, particularly capital coming in from, say, Britain, France, and Germany. What's sort of a bummer is that it's very difficult to observe how much financing is coming from foreign markets versus domestic markets. So now let me explain a little bit about how the concession system works so you can understand what we examine when we see charters. So as I've mentioned already, corporations could only be formed through special imperial concession. And as an outcome of this process, every single corporate charter stands alone as a separate piece of law. And so this is reported in legal digests. So that's why we're able to collect this data relatively easily. However, at the end of the concession system, the result really represents the outcome of a negotiation with the government, what they're willing to allow a firm to write. So there's a back and forth process that you can observe in the archives. But even considering that negotiation process, corporations had a lot of freedom to design what they place in their charters. There was not just one uniform set of rules that all corporations had to adopt. And in particular, something that we've noticed in previous research is that corporations tend to give themselves a name. So either they call themselves an A corporation or a share partnership. These are both corporation types, but they give themselves a name, and this name seems to have meaning. It correlates with observable characteristics of the company. So for example, corporations that called themselves A corporations tended to be brand new firms with small denomination shares that circulated to a wide circle of investors, and they tended to be larger. Whereas the share partnerships tended to be existing enterprises that perhaps wanted to maintain control of their ventures, but add a little bit of investment. So they were frequently smaller firms overall that issue shares of very large denomination to smaller circles of shareholders. And a question that we have in this paper is how much these types are going to map to the provisions in charters and the way that they're financed. So, but just in case we run out of time, I'll give you a quick preview of our findings. So I'm going to argue and show to you that these types I've just described really do map quite well to the governance provisions that are written in charters. I'll show you that the particular provisions in charters that we focus on, namely voting rights, are associated with capital structure and also have consequences for corporate performance in terms of the return on equity or their returns on the market. And what we're going to interpret these findings as showing is that this is going to show you that Russian corporations actually enjoyed a relatively large amount of flexibility within this system, and that flexibility reflects a trade-off between attracting external finance and maintaining control. So now let me tell you about our very exciting data sources. So our key source here is a newly collected database of governance provisions from Russian corporate charters, roughly from the years 1894 to 1910, with some gaps because of missing sources. We're going to connect those charters then to very detailed balance sheet information from Ministry of Finance yearbooks. This gives us balance sheet information, so all financials for corporations active from roughly 1899 to 1914. And then we connect all of this to two additional sources. So one is the RusCorp database, which is publicly available, that gives us additional characteristics at firm founding, and also the St. Petersburg Stock Exchange project, which is available through the Yale International Center for Finance, which gives us average stock returns that we compile. So let me just show you how this works. So this is an example of a particular corporate charter for the Riga Paint Company. And so this is first to shock you with the Russian a little bit, but they're very detailed. They have about 68 provisions. And what I've highlighted here for you is the voting rights provisions from section 64. And so what we're going to do is comb through these. And how we'll do this is we're going to actually build on the scaffolding provided by RusCorp. So RusCorp already gives us all of the corporations founded in the Russian Empire and a lot of their basic information of founding. And so we add a large array of governance provisions to this, including the Hilt Index, which is a measure of voting rights concentration. And I'll just pause here to remind you that what this index means is an index of 1 will correspond to a voting rights scheme of 1 share, 1 vote. And so we think of that as being highly concentrated, whereas lower values of that are more graduated and are more favorable to smaller shareholders. We also collect rules about shareholder meetings and quorums, some reporting rules, and also just the overall count of the number of provisions. And this is how many we've collected so far. So we have about 1,400 charters. This took us a very long time, at least years, to put this all together. And I also highlight this to show you that there are some gaps. So for example, the sources we've been using in Helsinki at the National Library of Finland, they're actually missing a lot of 1898. They're missing the year 1908. So we're not finished with the primary sources, but we're pretty close. Now we take these charters and then connect them to the balance sheet information provided by the Ministry of Finance. So here's Riga Paints and the balance sheets. So you can see this one row here for Riga Paints shows us all the information about their assets and liabilities, for example, their profits, how much credit they have, their balance of equity. And then we can also connect that to their entry in the St. Petersburg Stock Exchange project to get their market returns. So what I will relatively quickly walk you through here is our empirical approach. We're going to do this in 3 stages. So first, we'll begin with just a sanity check for our previous work. So does corporation type, as we've argued, really map well to the governance provisions? So we'll regress 4 key provisions on the corporation type, its industry and region. And what we expect is that the A corporations are going to have to provide provisions to protect smaller shareholders. So they should have a smaller value of that voting rights index. We'll also then investigate whether those governance provisions matter for corporate capital structure. So what we expect is that more graduated voting rights will be associated with an attempt to attract more small shareholders, and hence we'll see a greater reliance on equity. And we'll also consider, therefore, whether credits and assets and the property asset ratio regressed on the Hilt Index type and controls give us this expectation. We'll also investigate whether governance has performance outcomes in terms of return on equity and the market to book ratio. And so what we expect is that corporations with more concentrated voting rights will be penalized And so more concentrated voting rights will be associated with a lower return on equity and a lower market to book ratio. Okay, so I won't be able to go through these in very much detail. Naomi, how much time do I have left? I think we started early. We got it, okay? So I'll go through this relatively quickly. So in this regression, you can see that A corporations indeed have lower values of the Hilt Index. Because these A corporations are larger, they tend to have more directors. They tend to have a larger number of shares required for voting, and they tend to be less likely to require a list of shareholders prior to the meeting because shareholders tend to be anonymous. Here you can also see, borne out as we predicted, that there's a relationship between voting rights and size and share price. So A corporations tend to be larger, they tend to have smaller shares, and also corporations with higher values of the Hilt Index tend to be larger. Okay, now let me take you through the consequences for financing and for performance. So what we see here is actually, contrary to our expectations, corporations with concentrated voting rights actually tend to borrow less. They tend to actually have higher equity ratios. However, they do tend to have less fixed assets. So the voting rights index perhaps has a consequence for the ability of these corporations to add fixed assets like machines. Finally, we can see here that voting rights and also corporation type have consequences for performance. These results are less robust than what I've shown you previously, but generally what you can see, especially in the median regressions, is that corporations with a higher value of the Hilt Index have lower return on equity and also lower market to book ratios. So what we've provided here is simply a first description of Imperial Russian corporate governance. This is the first attempt to try to do this at any kind of corporation level. And there are a lot of questions you may have that I'm expecting to get that they're just really difficult to answer. I mean, it's natural to be curious, for example, about who were these shareholders and do these voting rights have something to do with shareholding? But unfortunately, we don't have access to shareholder lists, so much of that we can't say. And we also, it's really hard to understand what proportion of shareholding was foreign or domestic, or does it relate to ethnicity? These are natural questions. We have some work to do, so our next tasks include for further investigating of more charter provisions. We have collected more, but this is just a small snapshot of what we have. And also we're hoping to make use of a database that we've started to compile on charter amendments, which will allow us to investigate how changes in rules can result in changes in finance and performance. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. We have Eric Hilt is in the queue.
Well, thank you for this wonderful paper. Just absolutely fascinating to see what's going on in Russian corporations at this time. I have a few questions about these voting rights. I don't know to what extent you have access to sources in which incorporators are explaining their reasoning or perhaps negotiating with the state, but I wonder if you ever see commentary on why they want to restrict the rights of the voting rights of large shareholders. Just as you know, there's a lot of interesting theories that can potentially explain this. Henry Hansmann's work talks about, the effects on consumers of restraining like big monopolies and corporate power. My own work emphasizes, sort of attracting investments from small shareholders and offering them enhanced voting rights as a result. So I'm curious if you have a sense of what the thinking behind this was in the Russian context. And if I may have a quick follow-up question about these voting rights. So, when you see a graduated voting rights scheme in an American corporate charter from the early 19th century, you typically see a scheme where they say, you have 1 vote per share for the first 10 shares, and then like 15 votes for 20 shares, and 20 votes for 40 shares, and so on. Okay, so it's a formula like that. And the interesting thing about it is how punitive that is, a given formula like that is, for the power of large shareholders depends on how many shares they have, right? And so, a lot of these corporations would take like the same formula that was, well understood, and then in one corporation there might be 1,000 shares, in another corporation there might be 10,000 shares, and the effect of that, like, you know, it varies with the amount of shares. So I'm curious, when you read these Russian charters, are they using the same formula again and again, and then creating a different index value by just having more shares or less shares, or are they like carefully tailoring the formula for their specific circumstances with super complicated things? So I think that might reveal something about whether or not this is just kind of like a cookie cutter thing that is put in, or whether you know, that this is a deliberate, careful negotiation where they're, you know, precisely calibrating the rights of shareholders. So sorry about going on so long, but this is absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much for those great questions, Eric. So we are looking for a documentary smoking gun of the kind that you have described, right? Something that would be so lovely if they would just explain, we are designing our voting rights for this. And I feel like in the distant past, you know, when I was a graduate student hanging out in some archive somewhere, that I came across these things, and we're sort of combing through all the records. So cross fingers, that would be lovely. But otherwise, I think we're going to have to rely on secondary evidence and, you know, a group of theories and try to decide which one seems most plausible for this context. Also, thank you for your question about the way the voting rights schemes vary, because I didn't get to say this in the presentation. You know, they come in an incredible cornucopia of varieties. They are not all uniform. So indeed, what you describe in terms of this, the number of shares really mattering, like we definitely see that for some massive corporations that may have what looks like the same scheme, but they're going to end up with a different value of the voting rights index just because they have a different number of shares. However, there are all kinds of different bizarre schemes, ranging from a very simple one share, one vote scheme to some really elaborate and crazy, like punitive graduations for large shareholders. So it really strikes me when you see the variance in the way they write the voting rights that they're thinking about this. And so, yeah, I just really want to find a corporation, maybe in the process of negotiation with the government, how they explain how they arrive at these complex schemes. Thanks.
So the next person in the queue is Bill English, and then after that exchange, Steve Neffsinger is going to answer a question that's in the written Q&A. Okay, Bill.
Great.
Thanks, Naomi. And I also thought this was a terrific paper. But I wanted to follow up on one of the issues that Eric raised. He mentioned maybe there's kind of a negotiating process with the government. You've got to get your charter. And do we know anything about how that negotiation process looks? And in particular, who's actually making these decisions? Are these decisions that are being made by the firm or by the people who are setting up the firm? Or are they, in fact, in some sense, they're doing what they have to do to get the charter, so the decisions aren't really theirs? And a related question, given the type of government that you had in Imperial Russia, some of these decisions may have been made in ways that you were trying to get political protection from the government, and so I could imagine for example, you want to provide a lot of power to a particular patron who has a lot of political authority, and so this could be a really complicated and political and negotiated decision about how you're going to set up these structures. And I just wondered if we know anything about how that worked.
Thank you so much for those questions. And I'll just say in brief, you know, the negotiation process and thinking about how you get a charter through the government. I mean, it's just fascinating. So I've been able to read the records of the concession process in the Russian National Archives, and the way that it worked, as I understand it, like, you can think of a metaphor which is like submitting a paper to a journal, right? So you draft your charter, you give it a shot, and you're thinking what's going to be able to get through. And so corporations would have consulted with lawyers and perhaps insiders, writing a charter draft, and then they submit it to the Ministry of Finance for review. And then the Ministry of Finance sends back changes. And if you want to get your charter through, you make the changes. In what I remember, it's been a few years since I did this, but what I remember is that actually a lot of the negotiation was about capital. The government was really concerned about whether capital was going to be able to be paid in on time and how much they wanted to raise, and there was usually a negotiation on that amount. So in terms of who is making the decisions, I mean, ultimately it's a concession system. So what the Ministry of Finance wants, the corporation has to do. Although when they draft the initial charter, you can see how much variance there is across companies, which suggests that they're able to introduce some choice in what they're designing. Now, the politics are really interesting. And so were they trying to get political protection from the government? Yeah, that's a hypothesis. I think that's pretty popular for this context, that one outcome of the concession system may have been some kind of seal of approval from the government, like, we are certifying this company. How much does that matter? I've never been sure. But something that we've been interested in, and Steve and I have been interested in, and some of our other works, is the role of the identities of the people who are founding the company. In the charter, they list a collection of what they call founders, which may or may not be large shareholders or the previous owners of the company. And these founders they're listed there. And actually in the Roost Corp database, it's coded up who they were and whether they had political connections, for example, to the government. And we have found that those political connections, they matter somewhat. They don't seem to matter very much for the way that the corporation is financed, for example, in terms of its ability to attract credit or how it holds property or its market value, other dimensions like this. But it does seem to be important for entry. So it does seem to us in some of our other work that corporations that have literally, for example, a government official listed in their charter are able to found corporations that look observably weaker. So I hope that answers your questions more or less. I think that's what we can do.
That's interesting. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So Steve, would you repeat the question in the chat before you answer it?
I do have to admit, I accidentally hit the live response button. So,
Oh.
but this is a live response to Eva McKellar. The question she asked, which actually is related to what Bill was just saying, is in addition to negotiating the governance arrangements, did founders also negotiate for and trade monopolies? If they did, might they have affected how well they did economically? So it's actually a very interesting question. I mean, during this period of time, syndicates were legal and quite prominent in the Russian economy. And this is something that other people's work has focused on as sort of a big, I guess, impediment to industrialization overall, making entry hard and so on and so forth. We've actually done tried to make a major effort to sort of understand this sort of syndicated or sort of monopoly or sort of oligopolistic structure of certain industries. We don't have a very good handle on this yet. I think in future work, particularly in the stuff we're focusing in on finance, we will dig into this more. I should say we're not aware of particular, so because many syndicates were just fully legal, there wasn't necessarily any sort of negotiations ongoing with the government per se. But the government was actively involved in promoting certain industrial groups, you can call them. And so this probably was I guess, an important part of the context of thinking about the negotiations happening for any given individual firm. Was there a syndicate already in place? Was entry into that something that was also had to be dealt with? So it's worth thinking about more. Thank you, Eva.
Can I follow up briefly?
Yes,
on
please.
that? So thanks so much, Steve. So in the early years of when, so in our period, it's relatively late, right? 1890s and so on. I remember reading charters from the 1860s and earlier that specifically would indicate this company is being given a monopoly on X, right? And in exchange for doing X, we're giving this company a monopoly on wine production in Georgia, actually is one I know about. But in our period, you really don't see it explicitly indicated in the charters, but as Steve indicated, it seems likely that there's some kind of complex negotiation under, behind the scenes going on. For example, if you're going to found a cotton firm, there are syndicates in certain geographic areas for cotton textile production, and so something's going on in the background to let them join. I hope that answers that question.
So John Turner has a question. John, can you unmute yourself? And
thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Amanda. Really, really interesting paper. So my first question is around how the voting scales were applied in practice. So you attend a shareholder meeting, did there have to be a poll of shareholders before you implement it? The complex voting rules. So that's the first question. Second question is, were some of your provisions substitutes, or did you find that some of them were complements, that they went together? So again, just a couple of really quick questions. Thanks again.
For your first question, I'm not sure. I don't remember seeing any kind of requirement for, those rights kicking in. What can I say about this? Many companies have a minimum number of shares that you have to participate in a meeting or have a voting right at all. But otherwise, my understanding is that the scheme applies. If a quorum is met, the scheme applies. But I think maybe that's an interesting question. If you have an alternative in mind, we can investigate it and go back to the charters. And maybe Steve may have a comment, but that's as good as I think I can do for that question. And so, were some provisions substitutes and complements? Yes, it really does seem that way. And I think we can do better on this, but like in particular, if you just take the very simple slice that we have of corporation type, you can see, actually, here's a really simple example. So there's a reform in 1901 that adds provisions to charters. And you can see the increase in the number of provisions of charters after that reform happens. But what you also see is that the voting rights index starts to creep up. So in other words, when corporations have to include more provisions about timing of shareholder meetings and such, they actually let their voting rights concentrate a little bit. So you can see a give and take on a dimension as simple as that. So that's something we can continue to investigate. That's a really great suggestion.
A quick follow-up to your answer. I was really struck by the number of your corporations that had minimum number of shares required to vote, and with the median being 10, and substantially more at the top of the range. So I'm wondering, in this case, whether the health index is really the best measure of what's going on in terms of voting rights, that there may be large numbers of shareholders that are actually effectively disenfranchised, right? And then when you look at table 5, so you drop the analysis of the number of shares required to vote, but if you look at table 5, they're very statistically correlated, highly correlated with the A corporations, which are the ones where you're saying you have more democratic voting. So I think this is actually puzzling, and it's possible that in these A corporations, lots of small shareholders are disfranchised, and then it's kind of interesting to think about what the graduated scheme means for the larger shareholders, why they are setting those up.
Yeah, thanks for that. We were also really surprised to see these minima, and I think, it's a reasonable question. To what degree would these minima have been binding, right? It's hard to know how many shareholders would have had fewer than 10 shares. And it wouldn't shock me, the idea that they're sort of trying to speak out of both sides of their mouths. Like, look at our very generous graduated voting scheme. However, you can't vote unless you have X number of shares. So we should investigate. That's a great idea. Like, conditional on the size, what is the minimum? We can come up with something like that and see to what degree it was binding. Yeah, that's really cool.
Okay, Henry, would you like to jump in now?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in here. A favorite topic of mine. let me go back to a question that, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, question that Eric raised. My usual solipsistic approach to these questions here is, what has it got to do with me? And as you know, Mariana Pargender and I wrote a couple of articles some years back pushing the idea that these capped voting structures and regressive voting structures were adopted because the underlying company was essentially a consumer cooperative. That is, the investors were investing not to get return on capital, but to get a return on their business activities. So that banks or railroads or canals or bridges, roads, other firms that built monopolistic capital projects, capital intensive projects that were monopolistic, tended to be controlled by the consumers, and they didn't want a, so this seems to fit in nicely with your results. They, to pick up the last topic we talked about, number of votes, number of shares required to vote. In such an organization, you want to make sure that nobody can get control of the organization. No small subset of owners can get control, because you're worried they're going to run the price of the products or the services up and gouge the other members as customers. You might want minimum shareholdings to avoid the opposite problem, which is that a bunch of people will buy shares in the corporation and become interested in getting a return on their investment, and that's bad too. That means they're going to run the monopoly, the price of the services up to monopoly levels. So you want to get people in who are in that comfortable middle range, people who are putting enough in so that they've got a stake in the organization, but not so much that they can take over the organization. And you want it truly consumer controlled, a real cooperative here. The only way to find that out, I suppose, is to look at firms, look at individual firms, or look at the industries they're in. Since you probably know the latter very well from all the time you spend in these archives, which is wonderful work, let me say. Is the industry pattern of these voting restrictions consistent with or inconsistent with the theory that we've got consumer cooperatives out here?
I think I'm going to have to ponder. So what I can tell you is that, incorporation in this context tends to be concentrated in newer industries and more capital intensive industries. There are a lot of corporations, for example, as a ratio of all firms in cotton, metals and machines, chemicals, these kinds of industries. So I would have to think harder about how well that corresponds to a consumer cooperative kind of model of their behavior. But that's really interesting. Steve, do you have any comments on that question?
I mean, in a very narrow sense, relatively few of these corporations are directly providing services writ large to their owners. I think they're more of the sort of, we make paint and we sell it to people who buy paint, as opposed to we have a turnpike or we have a railroad and we are also landowners nearby. Right. So we don't know the full extent of that. And I've been answering some questions in the Q&A that relate to this about, it'd be nice to have a richer sense about connections across corporations among the founders and owners, or connection, what is the personal wealth of these individuals? These are all really hard things, particularly in a world where sort of the naming is hard to track and people have different spellings and all those sorts of concerns. But anyway, this is a good thing to think about, and particularly think about differences across industries about how we interpret some of our findings.
We have about 5 minutes left, so this is what we're going to do. Hannah has a question, we'll go to him now. And then maybe Steve, you maybe could finish up with responding to any questions in the queue that you haven't gotten to yet, so we can make sure they get answered. Okay, Les, go ahead.
I was thinking about what was happening in advanced economies at this time and which were perhaps the most influential in Russia. I mean, one of the characteristics, for example, of both the United States and the UK in the late 19th century is that they'd almost completely abandoned for new enterprises these peculiar voting structures. They had some inherited ones, but I think they were still more common in France. And the thing that's been mentioned in discussion already, that many small shareholders in Russia were completely deprived of the vote, hardly ever happened in America or Britain, but was very common in France. And I suppose that might be something to do with the fact that the main foreign investors in Russia were not Brits and Americans, but French. Is that plausible?
Thank you, Les. That is a great question. It's super plausible. And you'll see, I should have said, like, you'll see something very similar in Jihan's paper next.
Yeah.
Right. For those companies that have also similarly adopted more French style voting rights schemes. I think that's exactly right. Thank you.
Could I add as well? I mean, I think that's particularly true for our time period. So,
right.
By the mid 1890s, France is playing this inordinately large role in foreign finance in the Russian economy. Prior to 1890 something, or prior to 1890, Germany and Britain were much more important. So it'd be interesting to know, and our charters currently don't go back so far, so we could dig in further, think about that.
So we got a really great suggestion from Will Getzman by email. So we know a little bit about which of these corporations were listing on foreign stock exchanges. It might be interesting to see to what degree any of this correlates with just a dummy variable for listing on a French exchange.
Why don't Steve, Amanda, and I see Amy is here too. So why don't you just respond to anything left in the Q&A that you'd like to respond to, and we have like 2 minutes left.
I think I've cleared the list. So there was some wonderful suggestions and comments from people in the audience. Much about, actually, several comments about thinking about intermediaries. So what are, there's a certain set of these large shareholders who are banks themselves, and how are banks playing a role in this? This is something Eric will talk a lot more about, or other financial institutions. I think we've purposely focused mostly on industrials and know and are aware that banks and investment banks, particularly Russian banks in conjunction often with French, British, Belgian, German banks, were playing outsized roles in both sort of obviously for underwriting purposes, but also in terms of, I think, putting people on boards and actively trying to influence, trying to manage these firms. We haven't dug in too deeply yet into thinking about the balance sheets of banks and how they relate to the balance sheets of our firms. But this is on the agenda for the longer term. But thank you for those types of suggestions.
Okay, well, this was a wonderful opening session with a great paper, and we'll have lots to chew over in the rest of the day that will relate to this paper. And I'm sure there'll be more to say about it at the end of the day as well.